In a
They were just
2016
kids, just
podcast
like me.
interview, a Vietnam War
were
veteran
scared,
named Roger
they were
Hayden
homesick.
spoke words that would
They just
surprise
wanted to go
military
home.
historians and special operations
stories we
enthusiasts
tell
worldwide.
Are
The former
stories
Navy
that
SEAL
define
Chief
us.
Warrant Officer, a man who had attended Army Ranger School and multiple elite training programs, made a startling admission about his 10 days operating with the Australian Special Air Service in Vietnam. He had learned more about reconnaissance during those 10 days with the Australians than he had learned anywhere else in the world. This wasn't false modesty or empty praise. It was the honest reflection of a warrior who had just witnessed a completely different philosophy of warfare, and in that witnessing, recognized fundamental gaps in his own training that would cost American lives. His testimony revealed something that decades of official military records had never fully captured. The most effective special operations unit in Vietnam wasn't necessarily the one with the most advanced equipment, the biggest budget, or even the most celebrated reputation. Sometimes it was the one that understood silence. To understand this story, you need to understand who these men were and what they faced in the jungles of Southeast Asia. In January of 1962, President John F. Kennedy established SEAL Teams 1 and 2, creating the Navy's answer to unconventional warfare. These teams were drawn from the existing underwater demolition teams, frogmen who had proven themselves in World War II and Korea. The SEALs, an acronym standing for Sea, Air, and Land, were designed as the maritime counterpart to the Army's Special Forces Green Berets. Their mission was to conduct counter-guerrilla warfare and clandestine operations in riverine and maritime environments, skills that would prove essential in the waterways of Vietnam. The men who became the first SEALs underwent training that was revolutionary for its time. They learned hand-to-hand combat, high-altitude parachuting, demolitions, foreign languages, and a host of unconventional warfare skills. After completing the grueling basic underwater demolition SEAL training, known as BUD-S, they attended additional specialized schools: Army Ranger School at Fort Benning, the Army's Jungle Warfare School in Panama, Marine Corps Cold Weather Survival Training, SEER programs teaching survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. These men were pushed to their absolute physical and mental limits, forged into what many considered the Navy's most elite warriors. When SEAL Team 1 began deploying to Vietnam in early 1966 for direct action missions, they brought this extensive training with them. 8 SEAL platoons eventually rotated through the country on a continuous basis, typically operating in 12-man units divided into 2 squads of 6 men each. Their primary area of operations was the Rung Sat Special Zone and the Mekong Delta, a vast labyrinth of rivers, canals, and mangrove swamps where conventional military tactics proved ineffective against the Viet Cong. The SEALs developed a reputation quickly. They conducted nighttime ambushes, hit-and-run raids, reconnaissance patrols, and intelligence-gathering operations. They moved primarily by boat, inserting from the rivers and waterways that crisscrossed South Vietnam's southern regions. They began experimenting with helicopter insertions as the war progressed, developing air assault tactics that would become standard in future conflicts. The Viet Cong called them the men with green faces because of the camouflage paint they wore, and they learned to fear SEAL operations in their traditional strongholds. By most conventional measures, the SEALs were extraordinarily successful. Between 1965 and 1972, SEAL Teams 1 and 2 accounted for 600 confirmed enemy killed and 300 more likely killed. They captured numerous prisoners, gathered invaluable intelligence, and received 5 presidential unit citations. 3 SEALs would receive the Medal of Honor during the Vietnam War. Their psychological impact was significant, bringing a personal war to an enemy that had previously operated with relative impunity in remote areas. For a force that never exceeded 120 men in country at any one time, these were remarkable achievements. But there was a problem that few people talked about openly, a problem that would only become clear when men like Roger Hayden spent time with their Australian counterparts. The problem wasn't courage or dedication or physical capability. The problem was noise. The problem was approach. The problem was that despite all their training in unconventional warfare, many SEALs were still thinking and operating like conventional infantry who happened to arrive by boat. Roger Hayden had experienced this firsthand. When he arrived in Vietnam with SEAL Team 1, he and his fellow operators were thrown directly into operations with minimal transition from the men they were replacing. They arrived in country and took over missions the same day, flying into a South Vietnamese base near the U Minh forest with little preparation. They were doing what Hayden later described as dartboard operations, throwing a dart at a map and going wherever it landed. It was aggressive, it was bold, and according to Hayden himself, they lost a lot of SEALs because of their lack of fieldcraft preparation. Fieldcraft. That word would become central to Hayden's understanding of what the SEALs were missing. In UDT training, the frogmen simply didn't have the fieldcraft to be out in the jungle looking for people. They were demolitions experts, beach reconnaissance specialists, men trained to operate in and around water. When the Navy needed them to become jungle fighters, they adapted, they learned, they fought, but there were fundamental skills they hadn't developed, techniques they hadn't mastered, because their organizational DNA came from a different type of warfare entirely. The Australian SAS, by contrast, had been perfecting jungle warfare for over a decade before they arrived in Vietnam. The regiment had been formed in 1957, modeled after the British SAS, with whom they shared the motto, "Who dares wins." But their true education in jungle operations came during the Indonesian confrontation in Borneo from 1965 to 1966. In the dense triple canopy jungles of Borneo, the Australians learned to operate in small patrols deep in enemy territory, conducting reconnaissance and cross-border operations that required absolute silence and supreme fieldcraft. When 3 Squadron SASR deployed to Vietnam in June of 1966, arriving at Vung Tau and moving to Nui Dat, they brought with them a completely different operational philosophy than their American allies. The Australians operated in 5-man patrols: a lead scout, patrol leader, second in command, signaller, and medic. These 5 men would insert by helicopter and then disappear into the jungle for days or even weeks at a time. No scouts detected their approach. No intelligence network tracked their movements. They simply vanished into the jungle and became part of it. Between 1966 and 1971, the Australian and New Zealand SAS conducted nearly 1,200 patrols in Phuoc Toi Province and surrounding areas. They eliminated over 600 enemy soldiers confirmed. Their own casualties during this entire period were almost non-existent. 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidental deaths, 1 missing, 1 death from illness. 28 men were wounded. That casualty ratio was unprecedented in the entire war. No other unit, American or Allied, achieved anything close to it. But statistics don't explain what made them so effective. The numbers don't capture what Roger Hayden witnessed during his 10 days in the jungle with an Australian patrol. an experience that fundamentally changed how he understood special operations. When Hayden, then with SEAL Team 1, invited the Aussies to operate in his area of responsibility, he expected to see familiar tactics executed by allies with different accents. What he witnessed instead was something approaching art. For the entire 10 days, the Australians didn't speak, not a word. They communicated entirely through hand and arm signals, even when resting, even when the tactical situation seemed relatively secure. This wasn't showing off or maintaining radio discipline. This was complete operational silence as a fundamental principle. Hayden, accustomed to whispered conversations and occasional verbal communication in the field, found himself in a world where sound itself had been eliminated as a tactical tool. The Australians moved differently than any American unit Hayden had operated with. They moved so slowly that they might cover less than a kilometer in an entire day of patrolling. They stopped every few hundred meters and sat absolutely motionless for 30 minutes, just watching and listening to the jungle around them. Every piece of metal equipment was wrapped in tape to prevent rattling. They mixed mud into their uniforms to eliminate any shine that might catch light through the canopy. They didn't smoke, didn't cook hot meals, didn't do anything that might produce sound or odor for weeks at a time. Hayden later reflected on the experience with Jocko Willink, a fellow SEAL, describing the Australian fieldcraft as something he had never encountered before. "You gotta have your stuff together," he said, the emphasis clear even decades later. The Australians weren't just quiet. They had developed a complete system of jungle movement that treated noise as a lethal vulnerability and silence as a weapon. The difference in approach became even clearer when Hayden learned about typical SAS patrol methods from the Australians themselves. Before an ambush, an SAS patrol might observe a trail or enemy position for 3 or 4 days, learning the patterns, identifying the routines, understanding the terrain so intimately that when they finally initiated contact, it was less an ambush than an execution. They knew where targets would be, how many there were, what routes they would use to flee. Every variable had been studied and accounted for. During contacts, the Australians unleashed devastating firepower designed to make the enemy believe they faced a much larger force than 5 men. They carried heavy weapons, employed high rates of fire, and coordinated their shooting to create overlapping fields of destruction. But the contact itself lasted only seconds, 60 seconds maximum. Then silence again. When reinforcements arrived, they found bodies and empty jungle. No spent brass, no blood trails, no footprints. The SAS collected their evidence, covered their tracks, and vanished. This methodical, patient approach stood in stark contrast to typical SEAL operations of the mid to late 1960s. SEALs generally conducted shorter patrols, often 24 to 48 hours. They moved faster, covered more ground, and often relied on their ability to call in support if situations deteriorated. Helicopter gunships, artillery, and naval gunfire were always available if a SEAL squad made contact and needed extraction or reinforcement. The American approach emphasized mobility, firepower on call, and aggressive action. There was nothing wrong with this approach in many tactical situations. SEALs achieved remarkable successes with these methods, but in deep reconnaissance, in situations where detection meant death and where support might be minutes away through hostile territory, the Australian methods offered advantages that American operators were only beginning to appreciate. The Australian SAS had refined their tactics to such a degree that captured Viet Cong documents from 1967 and 1968 specifically warned enemy units about them. These documents describe detailed tactics for engaging American forces and techniques for ambushing Australian infantry. But for the SAS, the guidance was simple and chilling. Avoid contact if possible. If contact is unavoidable, assume you are already under observation. Assume they know your positions and strength. Assume reinforcement has been called before the first shot is fired. Think about what that assumption reveals. The SAS had created such psychological dominance in their area of operations that enemy forces operated under perpetual uncertainty. Every trail became suspect. Every jungle clearing could conceal watchers. Every supply movement risked walking into an ambush that had been prepared days in advance. The SAS didn't need to patrol constantly or engage frequently. Their reputation did the work. Enemy units could never know if 5 silent professionals were observing them at that exact moment. Vietnamese fighters who survived SAS encounters and were interviewed after the war described this psychological impact in stark terms. You'd be moving supplies down a trail you'd used safely for months, they said. Suddenly, your point man would collapse without a sound, then another. Then chaos as automatic weapons fire erupted from positions you'd walked past without seeing. The engagement would last maybe a minute, then silence. When reinforcements arrived minutes later, they'd find bodies, but no trace of who killed them. Just empty jungle that had swallowed the attackers completely. In a 2015 documentary, a former female Viet Cong fighter put it even more directly. We were not afraid of the American GIs, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing, she said. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear. Not killed in battle, not dying heroically in firefights that could be understood and avenged. Just gone, erased from existence. The not knowing was worse than the dying. You couldn't prepare for an enemy you couldn't detect. The Vietnamese called the SAS Ma Rung, the phantoms of the jungle. It was a fitting name for men who had turned fieldcraft into such a refined skill that they seemed more like natural phenomena than human soldiers. They didn't fight the jungle. They became the jungle. And in becoming it, they achieved a level of operational effectiveness that transformed how special operations were understood. Roger Hayden wasn't alone in recognizing the superiority of Australian techniques. Other American Special Operations personnel who worked with or observed the SAS came away with similar impressions. The Australians provided instructors to the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang, beginning in September of 1966. This school, established to train American long-range reconnaissance patrol units in the skills needed for deep operations, became legendary among reconnaissance troops. The fact that Australian SAS personnel were teaching American soldiers revealed the respect their methods had earned. The Recondo School curriculum covered everything from map reading and intelligence gathering to weapons training and communications. But the Australian instructors brought something unique to the program: actual combat experience with techniques that worked. These weren't theoretical exercises or stateside training scenarios. These were lessons learned through successful patrols in the same jungles where the students would soon operate. The Australians taught patience. They taught silence. They taught the discipline of watching and waiting, of gathering information before acting, of treating reconnaissance as an art that required the suppression of every natural human impulse to move, to talk, to relieve tension through action. From 1966 to 1971, over 5,300 men were admitted to Maykavi Recondo School. Approximately 3,300 graduated as Recondos. These graduates spread throughout American reconnaissance units, bringing with them at least some exposure to Australian methods. They couldn't replicate the years of training and cultural development that made the SAS so effective, but they could adopt specific techniques, specific approaches to patrolling that improved their survival and effectiveness. The impact on SEAL training would be more gradual. The SEALs of the Vietnam era were caught in an interesting position. They had been created to fill a maritime unconventional warfare role, drawing on UDT lineage that stretched back to World War II. But Vietnam had turned them primarily into jungle fighters operating from riverine platforms. They became very good at this role, extraordinarily good, but they were essentially learning on the job, developing techniques through combat experience rather than through systematic training in jungle warfare fundamentals. Men like Hayden returned from Vietnam with new understanding of what was possible, what fieldcraft could achieve when developed to its highest level. They passed these lessons on to new SEALs, incorporated Australian techniques where possible, and slowly began shifting how the teams approached certain types of missions. The process was informal, driven by individual operators who had witnessed better methods and wanted to adopt them. This informal knowledge transfer revealed something important about special operations in general. The most valuable lessons often spread through personal relationships and direct observation rather than through official doctrine or training manuals. Roger Hayden could have read 100 reports about Australian patrol techniques, but spending 10 days in absolute silence with 5 Australians who moved like ghosts taught him more than any document could convey. He learned by watching, by experiencing, by recognizing his own limitations when confronted with masters of the craft. The Australian approach to reconnaissance required a cultural mindset that extended beyond individual techniques. It required patience that went against natural human psychology. When you're sitting motionless in hostile territory for 30 minutes at a time, every survival instinct screams at you to move, to get to relative safety, to close the distance to your extraction point. The discipline to resist that instinct, to trust that slow movement and perfect silence offer greater protection than speed, contradicts everything our evolution has programmed into us. The Australians had developed this discipline through a training and selection process that was extraordinarily demanding. SASR selection was considered the most challenging entry test in the Australian Army. Only a small percentage of candidates successfully completed the course. Those who did had proven they possessed not just physical capability, but the mental toughness to endure isolation, discomfort, and the constant threat of failure without breaking. When these men were organized into 5-man patrols and deployed to Vietnam, they operated with absolute confidence in each other's abilities. The 5-man patrol structure itself offered advantages. It was small enough to move quietly and remain concealed, yet large enough to provide all-around security and carry sufficient supplies for extended operations. If one man was wounded, 2 others could carry him out, while a 4th provided covering fire, and the 5th navigated or handled communications. The patrol leader could be confident that each of his 4 men was among the best soldiers Australia could produce, rigorously selected and extensively trained specifically for this type of operation. American SEAL platoons, by contrast, operated with 12 men divided into 2 squads of 6. This offered more firepower and more bodies for multiple tasks, but it also meant more potential for noise, more mouths to feed, more movement through the jungle that might be detected. The larger unit size made sense for raids and ambushes where firepower was essential, but it created challenges for pure reconnaissance where invisibility was paramount. The difference wasn't that one structure was inherently superior to the other. Both had their place, but it reflected different underlying philosophies about the purpose of special operations. The Australians emphasized information gathering and selective strikes when opportunities arose. The Americans emphasized direct action and aggressive engagement with the enemy. Both achieved remarkable results, but in situations where detection meant certain death and where support was distant, the Australian model offered distinct advantages. Some American operators who witnessed Australian methods struggled with the implied criticism of their own training and tactics. These were men who had endured Hell Week, had graduated from Ranger School, had proven themselves in combat. Being told, even indirectly, that they were too loud, too impatient, too reliant on technology and firepower could feel like an attack on their capabilities and courage. Hayden's willingness to openly acknowledge what he learned from the Australians required considerable humility and professional maturity. But that humility is exactly what separated the best special operators from merely good ones. The willingness to recognize when someone else had developed better techniques, to set aside ego and institutional pride, to learn from allies even when those lessons revealed your own weaknesses. This separated operators who continued to improve throughout their careers from those who stagnated after reaching an initial level of competence. The Australian SAS weren't perfect. They had their own challenges and limitations. Operating in small patrols for extended periods created enormous stress on the individual operators. The psychological pressure of maintaining absolute silence while deep in enemy territory, knowing that a single mistake could doom the entire patrol, took a toll that was difficult to quantify, but very real. Some men thrived under these conditions, others completed their tours and never wanted to experience that level of stress again. The casualty rates also didn't tell the complete story. The SAS could afford to be patient because they operated in a relatively contained area where they had intimate knowledge of the terrain and enemy patterns. They worked closely with the 1st Australian Task Force at Nui Dat, providing intelligence that supported conventional operations. This symbiotic relationship allowed them to focus on reconnaissance while others handled the large-scale combat operations. SEALs, by contrast, often worked for conventional commanders who needed immediate results. They were tasked with disrupting enemy supply lines, capturing prisoners for interrogation, conducting raids to keep the enemy off balance. These missions required a different tempo than pure reconnaissance. You couldn't spend 4 days watching a trail when your commander needed intelligence tonight, or needed that weapons cache destroyed by dawn tomorrow. So the lesson wasn't simply that SEALs should have copied Australian methods wholesale. The lesson was more nuanced. Different missions required different approaches. Pure reconnaissance missions, where gathering information was the primary goal and avoiding detection was essential, benefited from Australian-style patience and silence. Direct action raids, where destroying a target quickly was the objective, required different tactics, emphasizing speed and overwhelming firepower. What men like Roger Hayden learned from their Australian colleagues was the possibility of operating with far less noise and far more patience than they had thought possible. They learned that equipment could be silenced, that movement could be slowed to a crawl, that human senses could be trained to detect threats at remarkable distances when you disciplined yourself to watch and listen with complete focus. They learned that sometimes the most aggressive action was to do nothing, to sit motionless in the undergrowth and let the enemy pass while you gathered information about their numbers, their equipment, their routines. These lessons would influence American special operations for decades, as SEALs conducted operations in Panama, the Persian Gulf, Somalia, and Iraq. The emphasis on fieldcraft and operational silence continued to grow. Training programs incorporated more focus on reconnaissance skills. Patrol techniques emphasized noise discipline. The cultural attitude shifted from seeing reconnaissance as a lesser priority compared to direct action to understanding that high-quality intelligence gathering was often the most valuable contribution special operations could make. The Australian SAS continued to refine their methods as well. After Vietnam, they maintained their dual-role structure, rotating between green operations for regular special operations responsibilities and black operations for counter-terrorism. They deployed to East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan, consistently earning respect from Allied forces for their professionalism and effectiveness. The lessons learned in the jungles of Vietnam remained central to their operational approach, even as the environments and threats evolved. In Afghanistan particularly, Australian SAS units developed reputations similar to what they had achieved in Vietnam. They operated with patience, gathered intelligence meticulously, and struck with precision when opportunities arose. Coalition partners who worked with them often commented on their fieldcraft and tactical discipline, echoing the observations that Roger Hayden had made decades earlier. The relationship between American and Australian Special Forces strengthened considerably after Vietnam. The two nations regularly conducted joint exercises and personnel exchanges. American SEALs trained with the SAS Regiment at their base in Perth. Australian operators attended American schools and worked embedded with SEAL teams. This cross-pollination of techniques and approaches benefited both nations, creating a depth of institutional knowledge that individual nations struggling in isolation could never develop. Modern SEAL training now includes extensive emphasis on fieldcraft and reconnaissance skills that weren't as developed in the Vietnam era. The basic principles that Australian instructors taught at Recondo School — patience, silence, observation, meticulous planning — became woven into the fabric of American Special Operations training. Young SEALs going through Bud-S today learn techniques that can be traced back, in part, to lessons that men like Roger Hayden brought back from 10 silent days in the Vietnamese jungle. The story of American SEALs learning from Australian SAS techniques reveals something important about military culture and learning. The most technologically advanced military in the world, with the best-funded training programs and the most sophisticated equipment, still needed to learn basic fieldcraft from allies who had simply spent more time perfecting those specific skills. There was no shame in this. The shame would have been in refusing to learn, in letting pride prevent the adoption of better methods. Understanding why this knowledge gap existed requires examining the different evolutionary paths of the two units. The SEALs emerged from a naval tradition focused on amphibious operations and maritime environments. Their spiritual ancestors, the underwater demolition teams of World War II, had pioneered beach reconnaissance and obstacle clearance before amphibious assaults. These frogmen had faced Japanese defenders while swimming toward hostile beaches, had cleared underwater obstacles under fire, had proven that specially trained men could accomplish missions conventional forces couldn't. This heritage of maritime operations, of working in and around water, shaped the fundamental identity of naval special warfare. When President Kennedy established SEAL Teams 1 and 2 in 1962, he was responding to a perceived need for unconventional warfare capabilities that could counter communist insurgencies in the Third World. But the SEALs were created quickly, formed from existing UDT personnel with additional training grafted onto their maritime foundation. They attended schools run by other services, Army Ranger School, teaching small unit tactics and leadership, Army Airborne Training, qualifying them for parachute operations, Army Jungle Warfare School in Panama. They learned from the best training the American military could provide. But here was the critical difference. These schools taught American doctrinal approaches to warfare, approaches developed by a military that had overwhelming resources, air superiority, artillery support, and the ability to call in devastating firepower when situations turned bad. American military doctrine, even in special operations schools, assumed you had these resources available. You planned missions knowing helicopters could extract you. You developed tactics, assuming artillery could support you. You operated with the confidence that American military might could reinforce or rescue you if things went wrong. The Australian SAS developed under fundamentally different constraints. Australia was a smaller nation with limited resources operating far from home in Southeast Asia. During the Borneo campaign, SAS patrols often operated across the border in Indonesian territory where they absolutely could not be discovered. If they were detected, if they made contact, and things went badly, there was no extraction coming. There was no air support available. They were on their own in hostile territory, where capture would create an international incident. These constraints forced the development of techniques emphasizing absolute stealth over everything else. The British SAS, from whom the Australians had drawn their initial training and inspiration, had learned similar lessons during operations in Malaya during the 1950s. Fighting communist insurgents in the dense jungles of the Malayan Peninsula, the British had discovered that large-scale operations were ineffective. The enemy simply melted into the jungle when large forces approached, but small patrols that could live in the jungle for weeks, that moved silently and struck with precision, these could dominate terrain that conventional forces couldn't even locate the enemy in. The Australians took these lessons and refined them further during confrontation in Borneo. Between 1965 and 1966, before deploying to Vietnam, the SASR developed techniques for extended jungle operations that would become their signature. They learned to read the jungle like a text, interpreting bird calls, insect activity, changes in vegetation, the angle of sunlight through the canopy. They developed skills that indigenous peoples had practiced for centuries, but that Western militaries had largely ignored in favor of technology and firepower. When these men arrived in Vietnam, they brought with them a wealth of knowledge that simply didn't exist in American training programs. Not because American instructors were incompetent or American soldiers less capable, but because the institutional experience wasn't there. The United States military hadn't needed to develop these skills. American power had always been sufficient to overcome tactical deficiencies through sheer weight of resources. This created an interesting dynamic when elite forces from both nations began working together in Vietnam. The SEALs and the SAS had similar selection standards. Both chose men who were physically exceptional, mentally tough, and capable of operating under extreme stress. Both trained their operators extensively. Both deployed only after rigorous evaluation. On paper, they should have been roughly equivalent in capability. But capability in special operations isn't just about physical conditioning or marksmanship or tactical knowledge. It's about approach, about mindset, about the accumulated wisdom of how to operate in specific environments. And in jungle reconnaissance, the Australians simply had more accumulated wisdom. They had refined techniques through combat experience in environments where mistakes meant death. They had developed a culture that valued patience and silence above aggression and firepower. Roger Hayden's 10 days with the Australian Patrol exposed him to this accumulated wisdom in its purest form. He watched men who had internalized lessons to the point where they no longer needed to think consciously about noise discipline or movement techniques. It was instinctive, woven into their muscle memory and decision-making processes. When the patrol leader raised one finger and sniffed the air, detecting cigarette smoke from an enemy position hundreds of meters away, Hayden was witnessing skills developed through years of practice and refinement. The Americans had similar training in sensory awareness. They practiced detecting enemy presence, reading terrain, understanding jungle ecology. But they had perhaps 50 hours of instruction in these skills across multiple schools. The Australians had hundreds of hours, thousands of hours when you counted the actual combat experience they brought from Borneo. It was the difference between someone who had studied a language in school and someone who had lived immersed in that language for years. Both could communicate, but one spoke with a fluency the other couldn't match. This gap became particularly apparent in the approach to ambushes. American Special Operations Forces, including SEALs, generally planned ambushes based on intelligence about enemy movement patterns. You identified a likely route, you set up in positions that offered good fields of fire, you waited for the enemy to enter the kill zone, and you initiated the ambush with maximum violence. The entire process might take a day or two from planning to execution. This approach worked well and resulted in numerous successful operations. Australian SAS ambushes operated on a different time scale and philosophy. They might identify a trail or position of interest, then spend 3 or 4 days watching before ever considering an ambush. During this observation period, they would count every person who passed, note what equipment they carried, identify patterns in timing and group composition. They would observe the trail from multiple angles, understanding sight lines and potential escape routes. They would identify the enemy's habits, recognizing that soldiers often moved with the same rhythms and patterns as civilians going to and from work. Only after this exhaustive observation would they consider initiating contact. And when they did, every variable had been accounted for. They knew where targets would be when the ambush started. They knew how many there would be. They knew where survivors would run. They had planned not just the ambush itself, but the withdrawal, the rally points, the routes to extraction, all based on days of patient observation rather than hours of planning. This level of preparation struck many American observers as excessive. Why spend 4 days watching a trail when you could ambush the first group that came along? The Australian answer was survival and effectiveness. By watching for days, they ensured they were ambushing a valuable target, not just any random enemy patrol. They confirmed the pattern was reliable. They identified potential complications, and they drastically reduced the chance of things going wrong because they understood the environment so completely. From a purely statistical standpoint, the Australian approach proved superior for the type of operations they were conducting. Their casualty rate speaks to the effectiveness of patience as a tactical tool. One killed in action across 5 years of operations meant their techniques kept men alive even while achieving remarkable kill ratios. They weren't lucky. They were careful, methodical, and willing to abort missions if conditions weren't perfect. American SEAL operations of the same period show a different calculus. SEALs conducted hundreds of successful missions with acceptable casualties for the mission tempo, but the 48 SEALs killed in Vietnam, while a relatively small number given the intensity of their operations, still represented a significant loss of highly trained specialists. Some of these deaths resulted from factors no amount of fieldcraft could prevent: helicopter crashes, accidents, the simple chaos of combat. But others resulted from being detected at the wrong moment, from making noise that alerted enemy positions, from moving too quickly through terrain that needed slower, more deliberate movement. Hayden's candid admission that they lost a lot of SEALs because of lack of fieldcraft preparation wasn't empty self-criticism. It was recognition that men had died from preventable causes, from gaps in training that hadn't been recognized as gaps until exposure to better techniques revealed them. This realization must have been difficult for someone like Hayden, who had lost brothers in arms, who had to reconcile the fact that some of those deaths might have been avoidable if they had known then what they learned from the Australians. But that realization also drove change. Hayden returned from Vietnam and continued serving, passing on lessons to new SEALs, influencing how reconnaissance missions were planned and executed. He wasn't alone. Other operators who had worked with Australian, British, or New Zealand SAS brought back similar observations. Slowly, incrementally, American Special Operations began incorporating these lessons into training and operations. The MRCV Recondo School, where Australian instructors taught American reconnaissance personnel, became a key vector for this knowledge transfer. The school operated at Nha Trang from 1966 to 1971, training over 5,300 students with a 50% failure rate that ensured only capable candidates graduated. The curriculum was demanding, combining classroom instruction with practical exercises, culminating in an actual 5-day combat patrol in hostile territory. Students literally bet their lives to graduate, as contacts with enemy forces during training missions were common enough that some students were killed or wounded. The Australian instructors at Recondo School brought credibility that American instructors, regardless of their own qualifications, couldn't match. These were men who had conducted successful long-range patrols in the same jungles where students would operate. They could say from personal experience what worked and what didn't. When they taught about noise discipline, about patient observation, about reading terrain, students listened because these lessons came from operators who had proven these techniques kept you alive while achieving mission objectives. The school's impact rippled through American reconnaissance units. Long-range reconnaissance patrol companies, later reorganized as ranger companies, sent men through Recondo training who returned to their units with new skills and approaches. These graduates became squad and platoon leaders, trainers themselves, passing lessons on to soldiers who never attended the school. The institutional knowledge base slowly expanded, incorporating Australian techniques into American doctrine. SEALs were slower to benefit from these lessons in systematic ways. Naval special warfare didn't send large numbers of men through Recondo School the way Army units did. The maritime focus of SEAL operations meant jungle reconnaissance wasn't always their primary mission. They were often tasked with riverine ambushes, coastal surveillance, and operations where their unique insertion methods via waterways offered advantages other units couldn't match. In these missions, traditional SEAL tactics worked well, but as the war continued, some SEAL platoons found themselves conducting operations deeper inland, missions that looked more like Army reconnaissance than traditional SEAL operations. These missions exposed the fieldcraft gap more obviously. When you're days away from water, when extraction requires helicopter pickup through hostile territory, when your survival depends entirely on not being detected, suddenly the patient Australian approach makes more sense than aggressive American tactics. Individual SEAL leaders began adapting their patrol techniques based on these realizations. Platoons that had operated with Australian or British forces adopted elements of their approach, moving slower, stopping more frequently to observe, reducing noise discipline failures, spending more time in planning and reconnaissance. These weren't formal policy changes or training program revisions. They were tactical adaptations driven by operators who recognized better methods when they encountered them. The process was hindered somewhat by the rapid personnel turnover in SEAL teams during Vietnam. Officers typically did 1 or 2 tours. Enlisted SEALs might do 3 or 4 tours, but they weren't always in the same platoon with the same leadership. Institutional knowledge was difficult to build when personnel rotated so frequently. Lessons learned on one deployment might not transfer to the next platoon arriving in country. The informal nature of knowledge sharing meant some wisdom was lost with each rotation. Post-Vietnam, as the military drew down and SEALs refocused on maritime operations, there was a risk that the jungle warfare lessons might fade entirely. The 1970s and early 1980s were lean years for American special operations. Budgets were tight. Training focused on maintaining basic qualifications rather than developing new capabilities. The comprehensive training that produced Vietnam-era SEALs wasn't sustained at the same level, but the lessons didn't disappear entirely. Senior enlisted leaders and officers who had served in Vietnam remained in the teams through the 1970s and 1980s. They became instructors, training officers, senior enlisted advisors. They ensured that some of the hard-won wisdom from combat experience was preserved and passed on to new generations who hadn't experienced combat. Roger Hayden was one of these leaders, serving long enough to influence men who would later serve in Grenada, Panama, the Persian Gulf, and Somalia. The 1980s saw a renaissance in American special operations. Following the failed hostage rescue attempt in Iran in 1980, the military invested heavily in special operations capabilities. New organizations were created, training programs were revamped, budgets increased. The formation of United States Special Operations Command in 1987 gave Special Operations Forces a unified command structure and dedicated resources. This investment allowed systematic incorporation of lessons that had previously been passed informally. SEAL training programs in the 1980s and 1990s benefited from this investment and from the institutional memory of Vietnam veterans still serving. Reconnaissance training received more emphasis. Fieldcraft became a formal part of the curriculum rather than something you picked up informally. The patient, methodical Australian approach to patrolling was taught alongside more traditional American direct action tactics, giving operators a broader range of techniques to draw from based on mission requirements. International exchanges and joint training exercises also expanded during this period. Australian and American Special Forces had maintained close relationships since Vietnam, but these relationships deepened. SEALs trained at the SASR base in Perth, Australian operators attended American schools. Joint exercises in diverse environments allowed both nations to learn from each other. The relationship became more balanced as American forces incorporated lessons from Australians while sharing their own developments in technology, tactics, and training methods. By the time American forces deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq in the 2000s, SEAL training had evolved considerably from the Vietnam era. Reconnaissance skills that Hayden had found lacking in the 1960s were now standard parts of the curriculum. New SEALs learned fieldcraft fundamentals that earlier generations had to acquire through combat experience. They practiced patience and observation in training rather than discovering their importance under fire. They entered combat with knowledge that had cost lives to acquire decades earlier. But even with improved training, even with lessons incorporated into formal doctrine, there remained value in working directly with Australian forces. In Afghanistan particularly, coalition special operations worked together regularly. American SEALs operating alongside Australian SASR personnel in the same operations continued to observe and learn from their allies. The Australians maintained their reputation for patience and methodical approach, traits that served them well in the complex counterinsurgency environment of Afghanistan. Coalition partners in Afghanistan often commented on the different operating styles of American and Australian special forces. Americans were described as aggressive, kinetic, focused on direct action missions. Australians were described as patient, intelligence-focused, conducting extensive reconnaissance before strikes. Both approaches achieved results. Both reflected the cultural and organizational histories of their respective militaries. Neither was inherently superior in all situations, but each offered advantages in specific contexts. Modern SEAL training now includes extensive emphasis on reconnaissance and fieldcraft that would have been impossible in the Vietnam era. Selection standards have increased. Training is longer and more comprehensive. New technologies offer capabilities undreamed of in the 1960s. Night vision devices, advanced communications, precision weapons, these tools enhance operator effectiveness. But the fundamental principles that Australian instructors taught at Recondo School, patience, silence, observation, meticulous planning, remain central to successful special operations. Roger Hayden's testimony stands as a monument to that kind of intellectual honesty. Here was a man who had every reason to project confidence and expertise. He was a chief warrant officer, a Vietnam veteran, a SEAL who had proven himself in combat. Yet he freely admitted that he learned more about reconnaissance in 10 days with the Australians than he had learned anywhere else in the world. That admission wasn't weakness, it was strength. The strength to recognize excellence when you encountered it and to incorporate those lessons into your own practice. This kind of honesty is rare in military culture, particularly in elite units where confidence borders on arrogance. Special operations personnel necessarily believe in their superior capabilities. They've endured selection processes designed to eliminate most candidates. They've completed training that pushes human limits. They've proven themselves in combat. This creates justifiable pride, but can also create resistance to admitting that others might have developed better methods. Hayden transcended this resistance. He recognized that admitting Australian superiority in fieldcraft didn't diminish his own accomplishments or those of his teammates. It simply acknowledged that different organizations develop different strengths based on their unique experiences and requirements. The Australians were better at jungle reconnaissance because they'd spent more time perfecting those specific skills. That didn't make them better warriors overall. It made them better at that particular specialty. The female Viet Cong fighter who said they hated the Australian SAS because they made comrades disappear was describing the ultimate achievement of special operations fieldcraft. When your presence is so difficult to detect that the enemy cannot develop countermeasures, when your actions seem more like inexplicable phenomena than military operations, you have transcended conventional warfare and entered a realm where psychology becomes as important as ammunition. The Australians achieved this not through superior equipment or massive firepower, but through discipline, training, and an absolute commitment to operational silence. When Roger Hayden and other American operators witnessed this achievement, they recognized what they were seeing. They understood that despite all their training, despite their courage and capabilities, they had missed something fundamental. They were making noise when they should have been silent. They were moving when they should have been watching. They were treating the jungle as terrain to traverse, rather than as an environment to inhabit. That recognition changed American special operations, not overnight, not through any single policy directive or training manual revision, but gradually, as operators who had seen better methods passed those lessons on to the next generation. The process continues today. Every time American and Australian special forces train together, every time operators share techniques and approaches, the collective knowledge base deepens. The best practices of one nation inform the evolution of another. In the end, the story isn't about American inadequacy or Australian superiority. It's about the constant pursuit of excellence in an incredibly demanding profession. It's about the humility to learn from others, the wisdom to recognize when someone has developed better methods, and the courage to change your approach even when that change implies criticism of what came before. Roger Hayden possessed all these qualities. So did the Australian SAS operators, who spent 10 days teaching through demonstration, never speaking but communicating volumes through their actions. The jungles of Vietnam are quiet now, reclaimed by agriculture and forest. The trails where Viet Cong fighters moved supplies are overgrown or paved. The bases where SEALs and SAS planned operations have long since been abandoned. But the lessons learned there persist. Every time a SEAL patrol moves through hostile territory with absolute silence, every time operators wait patiently for hours to gather critical intelligence, every time American Special Forces demonstrate the fieldcraft that makes them among the world's most effective warriors, they honor the legacy of those who learned humility in the jungle and taught it to those who followed. And somewhere in that legacy, 10 silent days with 5 Australians who moved like ghosts remain etched in memory, a reminder that excellence has many teachers, and wisdom means recognizing them when they appear.